The flames reached higher into the night sky than Willow Ashford had ever seen, turning her modest homestead into a roaring inferno that threatened to consume everything she'd worked so hard to build. She'd woken to the acrid smell of smoke, and now stood barefoot in her nightgown, her golden hair loose around her shoulders as she watched her life burn before her eyes. Then she heard the desperate, terrified clucking from her chicken coop at the edge of the property, and without thinking she ran toward the danger. Pioche, Nevada, 1876, was no place for a woman alone, but Willow had managed for 3 years since her father's passing. The silver mining town nestled in the hills of Lincoln County had seen its share of booms and busts, and right now, Willow's small ranch on its outskirts was experiencing the most devastating bust of all. "My chickens," she cried, lunging toward the coop as sparks landed on its roof. Those hens were her livelihood, their eggs the main source of her modest income. Without them, she'd have nothing left. As she ran toward the wooden structure, strong arms suddenly caught her around the waist, lifting her off her feet as she kicked and screamed. "Let me go, they'll burn alive." Willow struggled against the iron grip that held her back from the flames. "You can't go in there, miss." The deep voice belonged to a man she'd never met. "That roof's about to collapse. I don't care." Willow fought harder. "Those chickens are all I have." The stranger set her down but maintained his grip on her shoulders, turning her to face him. In the orange glow of the fire, she saw a tall man with a weather-worn face, piercing hazel eyes, and a stubbled jaw. His Stetson was pulled low, and his duster flapped in the hot wind created by the blaze. "You're worth more than that, Coop," he said firmly, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "And I ain't about to let you die for some chickens." Before Willow could protest further, a section of her house collapsed with a deafening crack, sending a shower of sparks toward them. The man pulled her farther back, shielding her with his body. "I'm Hank Navarro," he said, his voice raised over the roar of the fire. "I was riding by and saw the flames from the road." He looked at her with a mixture of concern and determination. "Now, where's your well?" Dazed, Willow pointed toward the water source, and within seconds, Hank was organizing an impromptu rescue effort. He grabbed a bucket, filled it with water, and to Willow's astonishment, headed not toward the house, which was clearly beyond saving, but toward the chicken coop. "The house is lost," he called over his shoulder. "But we might save your birds." For the next hour, Willow and the mysterious cowboy fought the fire together, passing buckets back and forth until their arms ached and their faces were streaked with soot. By some miracle, they managed to keep the flames from consuming the coop entirely, though one corner was badly charred. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, casting the devastation in harsh light, Willow sat exhausted on an overturned barrel, watching as Hank checked on her surviving chickens. 12 had made it through the night, 4 hadn't. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice rough from smoke and exhaustion. "You didn't have to do that." Hank looked up from where he was repairing the damaged corner of the coop with some salvaged boards. "Yes, I did," he said simply, hammering a nail with practiced efficiency. "Couldn't just ride on by." Willow studied him properly for the first time. He was older than her 23 years, perhaps 30 or so, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the sun. His hands were calloused, his movements efficient. This was a man who knew hard work. "Where were you headed?" she asked, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance in nothing but a soot-stained nightgown. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling vulnerable. "Nowhere in particular," Hank replied, his focus on his task. "I've been working ranch jobs up north. Heard there might be work in Arizona." He glanced up at her. "I can stay on a day or two, help you sort this out." "I couldn't ask that of a stranger." "You didn't ask." He stood, dusting off his hands. "I offered." Willow wanted to refuse. She'd learned to be self-sufficient after her father died, leaving her with a small ranch and a mountain of debt. Accepting help, especially from a man she didn't know, went against everything she'd taught herself about survival. But looking at the smoldering ruins of her home, she knew she had little choice. "I have a neighbor," she said finally. "Mrs. Benton, about a mile down the road. I can stay with her while I—" Her voice trailed off as she surveyed the destruction. "While you rebuild," Hank finished for her. Something in his tone made her look at him, the certainty that rebuilding was possible when all she could see was ruin. Willow nodded slowly. Yes, while I rebuild. After gathering what little had survived the fire, some tools from the shed, a trunk of her mother's things she'd managed to drag out before the flames took hold, and her father's rifle, Willow and Hank walked the mile to Mrs. Benton's place in silence, leading Hank's horse behind them. The sun was fully up now, promising another scorching Nevada summer day. Mrs. Benton, a widow in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, took one look at Willow's ash-covered face and nightdress and ushered her inside with murmurs of sympathy. She cast a suspicious glance at Hank, who respectfully removed his hat and explained the situation. "You'll stay too," the older woman declared after hearing his account. "We need strong hands to help Miss Ashford get back on her feet. There's a cot in the barn where my late husband used to nap during harvest." Despite his protests that he was only passing through, Hank found himself accepting the arrangement. Something about Willow's quiet dignity in the face of disaster had struck a chord in him. He'd seen his share of hardship and knew the value of a helping hand when you were down. That night, after a simple but satisfying dinner at Mrs. Benton's kitchen table, Willow stepped onto the porch where Hank sat smoking a cigarette, gazing at the stars. She'd bathed and changed into a borrowed dress that hung a bit loose on her slender frame. "I want to thank you properly," she said, sitting beside him on the porch steps, "for saving my chickens." "They may seem like a small thing to you, but they're not a small thing," Hank interrupted, tapping ash from his cigarette. "They're your livelihood, I understand that." Willow studied him. "You're not from around here." "No, madam, originally from Texas, been drifting since the war ended." "The war," Willow nodded. Many men had returned from the Civil War, changed, restless. 11 years had passed, but the wounds remained for many. "My father fought, lost his leg at Gettysburg." Hank was quiet for a moment. "I was too young to fight properly, joined up near the end." "Saw enough, though?" They sat in companionable silence, the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote the only sounds in the still night. "I should be moving on," Hank said finally. "Arizona won't wait forever." "No," Willow agreed, "but perhaps it could wait a few days." She hesitated. "I have some money saved, not much, but I could pay you to help me rebuild the chicken coop properly. Maybe put up a lien to where I could stay until I figure out what to do about the house." Hank considered her offer, looking out at the darkened landscape. He'd been drifting for years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. The thought of staying, even for a short time, felt strangely appealing. "All right," he said finally, "but keep your money. I'll help you get back on your feet, and then I'll be on my way." Willow wanted to protest, to insist on paying him, but something in his expression stopped her. "Thank you," she said instead, her voice soft in the darkness. The following morning, Hank rode into Pioche proper to purchase lumber and supplies, using money he'd been saving for his journey south. The town was a lively place, with saloons and brothels doing business at all hours, alongside more respectable establishments like the general store and the assayer's office. Silver mining had transformed the once quiet settlement into a bustling center of commerce and lawlessness. As Hank loaded supplies onto the wagon he'd borrowed from Mrs. Benton, he noticed a group of men watching him from outside the Silver Dollar Saloon. Something in their stance put him on alert, a survival instinct honed by years on the frontier. "You buying for the Ashford place?" One of the men called out, stepping forward. He was expensively dressed, with a gold watch chain glinting across his vest. Hank straightened. "That's right. Waste of good lumber," the man said, approaching. "That land's not worth rebuilding on." "Seems the owner disagrees," Hank replied evenly, his hand instinctively moving closer to the revolver at his hip. The well-dressed man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She'll come around. Name's Victor Caldwell. I own the Silverton mine and most of the property around here. Been trying to buy that worthless patch of dirt for 2 years, but old man Ashford was stubborn as a mule. Thought his daughter might be more reasonable." "Doesn't sound like it," Hank said, tying down the last of the lumber. Caldwell's smile disappeared. "Fires happen. Especially when people don't know their own best interests." Hank's blood ran cold as the implication became clear. Before he could respond, Caldwell turned and walked back to his companions, leaving the threat hanging in the air, the ride back to Mrs. Benton's was tense as Hank mulled over the encounter. By the time he reached the farm, he'd made a decision. When he found Willow collecting eggs from her rescued chickens, now housed in a makeshift pen behind Mrs. Benton's barn, he didn't waste words. "Your fire wasn't an accident." Willow looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" Hank explained his encounter with Caldwell, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to understanding to anger. "That snake," she hissed, carefully setting down the basket of eggs. "He's been after our land since they found traces of silver on the property next to ours. Father always refused to sell, said we'd make our living honestly, not by chasing metal in the ground. He's dangerous," Hank warned. "Men like that don't take kindly to being refused." Willow's eyes flashed with determination. "Well, he'll have to get used to disappointment. I'm not selling either." Hank couldn't help but admire her spirit, even as he worried for her safety. "Then we'd better build something that won't burn so easily next time." Over the next week, Hank and Willow worked side by side from dawn until dusk, clearing the charred remains of her home and building a new chicken coop, this one with a stone foundation and a metal roof that would be more resistant to fire. Willow insisted on doing her share of the labor, and Hank found himself impressed by her strength and determination. Mrs. Benton often brought them lunch, watching with knowing eyes as the two worked together, their movements becoming more synchronized with each passing day. When she brought a pitcher of lemonade on a particularly hot afternoon, she found them laughing, Willow demonstrating how to properly handle a chicken without getting pecked. "You two make a good team," the older woman observed, pouring the drinks. Willow blushed and busied herself with securing chicken wire, while Hank simply tipped his hat in acknowledgement. That evening, as they sat on Mrs. Benton's porch sharing a quiet moment after dinner, Willow broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. "After the coop is finished, I was thinking of starting on a small cabin," she said, her eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere to sleep until I can afford something better." Hank nodded, knowing what she was really asking. "I reckon I could stay a bit longer." "Make sure it's built proper." Relief flooded Willow's face, though she tried to hide it. "I can pay you, no." His voice was firm but gentle. "Save your money, you'll need it for the winter." Willow looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the strength in his weathered face and the kindness in his eyes. "Why are you helping me, Hank Navarro?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "Sometimes a man gets tired of drifting." "Tired of not making a difference anywhere." He met her gaze. "I couldn't save my own home during the war, maybe I can help save yours." The personal admission hung between them, a rare glimpse beneath the surface of the stoic cowboy. Willow wanted to ask more, but sensed he'd shared all he was willing to for now. Instead, she reached out and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of understanding and gratitude that said more than words could. The next morning, they returned to Willow's land to find two men standing amid the ruins of her house. Hank immediately stepped in front of her, his hand moving to his gun. "Can we help you?" he called, his tone making it clear they weren't welcome. The men turned, and Willow recognized them as Caldwell's associates from town, the same ones who'd refused to extend her father's loan after his death, forcing her to take on extra work washing laundry for the miners just to make ends meet. "Just surveying the property," one of them said with a smirk. "Mr. Caldwell thinks it would make a fine location for worker housing once the new mine shaft opens." "This land isn't for sale," Willow said firmly, stepping out from behind Hank, "and you're trespassing." The men laughed. Mighty big words for a woman with nothing but a chicken coop and a hired gun. They looked at Hank with contempt. "How much is she paying you, cowboy?" Caldwell could double it. Hank's expression remained impassive. "I suggest you leave now while you still can." Something in his voice, or perhaps the way his hand rested on his revolver, convinced the men to retreat, but not without a parting shot. Caldwell always gets what he wants, one way or another. After they'd gone, Willow sank down onto a tree stump, trembling slightly. They burned down my home, she said, her voice hollow, and now they are acting like it's already theirs. Hank knelt beside her, his eyes serious. Willow, listen to me. Men like Caldwell, they're used to taking what they want. If you're determined to stay, you need to be prepared for a fight. She looked up at him, her blue eyes fierce despite her fear. I'm not afraid of a fight. This land is all I have left of my family. I won't let him take it. Hank nodded, recognizing the same stubborn courage he'd seen that first night when she tried to run into a burning building to save her chickens. Then we'd better get building, he said, standing and offering her his hand. And maybe stop by the sheriff's office in town, let him know what's happening. Willow took his hand, allowing him to pull her to her feet. Sheriff Davis, she laughed bitterly, he's in Caldwell's pocket, has been since the day he took office. Then we're on our own, Hank said grimly. For the next 2 weeks, they worked tirelessly, not just rebuilding the chicken coop, but constructing a small, sturdy cabin where Willow could live. Hank insisted on building it of stone where possible, with thick wooden shutters that could be barred from inside. It was a fortress as much as a home, designed to withstand both the elements and more deliberate threats. Word spread through Pioche about the determined young woman and the mysterious cowboy defying Victor Caldwell. Some townsfolk, tired of the mine owner's heavy-handed ways, began to stop by with offers of help, a basket of food here, a spare tool there. Others, dependent on Caldwell for their livelihoods, kept their distance. As they worked side by side, Willow found herself watching Hank when he wasn't looking, the careful precision with which he measured and cut, the strength in his arms as he lifted heavy beams into place, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when something pleased him. She caught herself wondering about his past, about what had set him on a life of drifting, and why he had chosen to stop, at least temporarily, to help her. For his part, Hank found himself increasingly drawn to Willow's resilience and spirit. He admired the way she never complained about the backbreaking work, how she insisted on learning every aspect of construction so she could maintain the buildings herself, and the gentle way she cared for her chickens, speaking to them as if they were old friends. In the evenings, when they returned tired to Mrs. Benton's, he looked forward to their quiet conversations on the porch, learning about her childhood in Missouri, her journey west with her parents after the war, and her dreams for the future. One evening, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, Willow asked the question that had been on her mind for days. What will you do when this is finished? Still head to Arizona? Hank was quiet for a long moment, rolling a cigarette between his fingers without lighting it. I don't know, he admitted finally. Never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, not since the war. Why not? He sighed, finally striking a match and lighting the cigarette. Lost my family farm in Texas during the war. Yankees burned it. After that, didn't see much point in trying again. He took a long drag. But lately, I've been thinking maybe that's no kind of life. A man ought to build something that lasts. Willow's heart quickened at his words, but she kept her voice steady. There's plenty of land around here, if you wanted to stay. Their eyes met in the gathering twilight, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had voiced yet. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. They both stood as 3 riders came into view, their silhouettes dark against the sunset. Hank stepped in front of Willow, his hand on his gun. Evening, Navarro, called a familiar voice. Victor Caldwell himself, flanked by 2 men with rifles balanced across their saddles. Thought I'd come see this miraculous rebuild I've been hearing about. Private property, Hank called back. Miss Ashford isn't receiving visitors, Caldwell laughed. That's so. Well, I've brought her a proposition that might change her mind. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Final offer for the land, $500 more than generous for a burned-out patch of dirt. Not interested, Willow said firmly, stepping up beside Hank despite his protective gesture. Not now, not ever. Caldwell's smile disappeared. Don't be a fool, girl. That silver vein runs right under your worthless chickens. One way or another, I'll have that land. Is that a threat? Hank's voice was dangerously quiet. Call it a certainty, Caldwell replied, tucking the envelope away. You've got until the end of the week to accept my offer. After that, he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its menace. Well, accidents happen, even to brave little ladies and their hired guns. He tipped his hat mockingly. Good evening to you both. As they rode away, Willow let out a shaky breath. He won't stop, will he? No, Hank said grimly. He won't. He turned to her, his expression serious. Willow, I think you should consider his offer. Take the money and start fresh somewhere else. She stared at him, betrayal flashing in her eyes. You too, after all we've built. I'm thinking of your safety, Hank said, reaching for her arm as she turned away. Caldwell has the money and the men to make good on his threats. And I have the deed to my land and the right to live on it without fear. Willow pulled away from his grasp. I thought you understood that. I understand that your life is worth more than this piece of land, Hank insisted, his frustration evident. You nearly died trying to save those chickens. Now you're risking your life again for what? Pride, for my home, Willow shot back, for everything my father worked for the future he wanted for me. She looked at him with disappointment. I thought you were different, Hank Navarro. I thought you understood what it means to fight for what's yours. Without waiting for his response, she walked back into Mrs. Benton's house, leaving Hank alone on the porch with the dying light of the sunset and the weight of his concerns. That night, Hank couldn't sleep. He paced the small barn loft where he'd been staying, torn between his growing feelings for Willow and his fear for her safety. He knew men like Caldwell ruthless, powerful, used to getting their way. The mining magnate wouldn't hesitate to use violence if he thought it necessary. By dawn, Hank had made his decision. After a brief explanation to Mrs. Benton, he saddled his horse and rode into Pioche as the town was just beginning to stir. The telegraph office was his first stop. He sent 3 messages, one to an old Army buddy now working as a U.S. Marshal in Carson City, one to a newspaper editor in Virginia City known for his exposés on corruption in the mining industry, and one to a lawyer in Salt Lake City who specialized in land disputes. If Caldwell was determined to use force, Hank would fight back with the law and public opinion. His next stop was more direct. The Silverton Mining Company's office was a grand 2-story building on Main Street with gilded letters on the windows and a polished brass door handle. Hank tied his horse outside and walked in without hesitation, ignoring the startled secretary who tried to stop him. Victor Caldwell looked up in surprise as Hank pushed open his office door. The mining magnate was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, a half-eaten breakfast in front of him. Navarro, he said, recovering quickly. Come to accept my offer on the girl's behalf, come to make one of my own, Hank replied, closing the door behind him. You're going to leave Willow Ashford and her property alone. No more threats, no more fires, no more accidents. Caldwell laughed, leaning back in his chair. And why would I do that? Because I've just sent telegrams to people who'll be very interested to hear about how you operate. A U.S. Marshal, a newspaper man, and a lawyer who specializes in taking down land grabbers like you. Hank stepped closer to the desk. You might own this town, Caldwell, but your reach doesn't extend much further. The mining magnate's smile faltered slightly. Empty threats, you've got no proof of anything. Don't I? Hank pulled a folded paper from his pocket. This is a signed statement from your former foreman detailing how you ordered him to start the fire at the Ashford place. He was mighty talkative last night at the saloon, especially after I bought him a few drinks. He placed the paper on the desk. Just a copy, mind you. The original is already on its way to Carson City with a friend. Caldwell's face reddened with anger. You're bluffing. Maybe, Hank conceded. But are you willing to risk your reputation, your business, maybe even your freedom to find out? He leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk. Here's my offer. You forget about the Ashford land, and I forget about this statement. You continue making your fortune from the silver you've already found, and Willow keeps her home and her chickens. Everybody wins. Caldwell stared at him, calculation evident in his eyes. Finally, he leaned back, a thin smile spreading across his face. You know, Navarro, I misjudged you, thought you were just another drifter with a gun, but you've got a mind for business. He tapped his fingers on the desk. All right, the girl can keep her worthless patch of dirt. I've got bigger concerns anyway, just opened a new shaft that's showing promising yields. Hank didn't trust the sudden capitulation, but he nodded, maintaining his stern expression. Smart decision, but know this, I'll be watching. And if anything happens to Willow or her property, those telegrams I sent will be just the beginning of your troubles. As he turned to leave, Caldwell called after him. She must be something special to inspire such loyalty in a man like you. Hank paused at the door but didn't look back. She is, he said simply, and left. When he returned to Mrs. Benton's farm, Willow was in the garden, helping the older woman harvest vegetables. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded after their argument the night before. "Where have you been?" she asked, setting down her basket. "Making arrangements," Hank replied vaguely. "I think Caldwell will be leaving you alone from now on." Willow's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "Nothing illegal," he assured her. "Just made him understand that harassing you would cause more trouble than it's worth." He hesitated, then added, "I'm sorry about last night. You were right, I should understand what it means to fight for what's yours, and I do." Willow studied his face, searching for the truth in his words. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding. And for whatever you did today." That afternoon, they returned to work on her cabin, the tension between them dissolved. As they set roof beams in place, Willow found herself watching Hank with new eyes. He'd gone into town and faced down one of the most powerful men in the territory, not for himself, but for her. The realization stirred something deep within her heart. By the end of the week, the cabin was nearly complete, a small but sturdy structure with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that caught the morning sun. Willow stood in the doorway, looking around with pride at what they had accomplished together. "It's perfect," she said, turning to Hank with a smile that lit up her face. "I never thought I'd have a home again after the fire." "It's a good start," Hank agreed, looking around at their handiwork. "Needs furniture, though, and curtains." "I can make curtains," Willow said, already envisioning the space with personal touches. "And Mrs. Benton mentioned she has an old table she doesn't need." She moved to the window, looking out at the chicken coop where her flock was settling in for the evening. "I can move in tomorrow, start fresh." Hank nodded, a strange reluctance gripping him. With the cabin complete and Caldwell neutralized, his reason for staying was gone. The road to Arizona beckoned, yet the thought of leaving filled him with an unfamiliar sadness. Willow seemed to sense his thoughts. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice carefully casual. Hank removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Thought I'd head south as planned, but—" He looked around the cabin, then at Willow herself, standing in a shaft of evening sunlight that turned her hair to gold. "Seems there might be reasons to stay." Hope flickered in Willow's eyes. "Such as?" "Well," Hank said slowly, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips, "someone needs to build a proper barn and fence the property. And there's talk of a new road coming through from Carson City might bring more settlers, more opportunities." "All good reasons," Willow agreed, moving closer to him. "Any others?" Hank looked down at her, at the courage and hope in her face, and found himself unable to maintain the pretense. "Yes," he said softly. "One more reason, the most important one." He reached out, hesitantly at first, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was electric, making them both pause as they realized how much had changed between them in just a few short weeks. "Willow," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion, "I came to Nevada looking for work, not—" He struggled to find the words. "Not for this, not for you, but now I can't imagine leaving." Willow's heart soared at his confession. She reached up, placing her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "Then don't," she said simply. "Stay, help me build something here, something that lasts." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a question being asked and answered without words. Then, as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, it deepened into something more, a promise, a beginning. Later that evening, as they walked back to Mrs. Benton's farm hand in hand, Willow found herself laughing with a lightness she hadn't felt since before the fire. "What's so funny?" Hank asked, smiling down at her. I was just thinking, she replied, squeezing his hand, that if it weren't for those chickens, we never would have met. Hank chuckled, pulling her closer to his side. Remind me to build them the finest coop in all of Nevada. The news that Hank Navarro, the drifter who had arrived in town just weeks earlier, was staying on at the Ashford place spread through Pioche faster than wildfire. Speculation ran rampant, with some suggesting he'd found silver on the property, others claiming he was hiding from the law, and a few romantic souls guessing the truth. That he had found something more valuable than any precious metal in the determined young woman who had tried to save her chickens from a fire. Mrs. Benton, for her part, watched the courtship unfold with maternal satisfaction. She had lost her own daughter to influenza years before and had taken Willow under her wing after Thomas Ashford's death. Seeing the young woman find happiness after so much hardship brought joy to the widow's heart. "He's a good man," she told Willow one afternoon as they prepared a special dinner to celebrate Willow's first night in her new cabin. "Rough around the edges, perhaps, but solid where it counts." Willow blushed, kneading bread dough with more vigor than necessary. "I think so, too." "Your father would have approved," Mrs. Benton continued, peeling potatoes at the sink. "He always said he wanted a son-in-law who could build things, not just buy them. We're not. That is, he hasn't." Willow stammered, her cheeks flaming. Mrs. Benton smiled knowingly. "Give it time, dear. Some things can't be rushed." That evening, as they shared a celebratory meal in Willow's new home, sitting on crates around the makeshift table, using mismatched plates donated by neighbors, Willow looked around at the small gathering and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Mrs. Benton, Hank, and even old Pete from the neighboring farm who had brought a jug of his homemade cider, they had become her family, forged in adversity and bound by something stronger than blood. After the others had gone, Hank lingered, helping Willow clean up. The domesticity of the moment struck them both how natural it felt to be moving around the small space together, their actions complementary, their conversation easy. "You know," Hank said as he dried the last plate, "I was thinking about what you said about needing to build a barn." He hung the dish towel carefully on a peg by the sink. "If we're going to expand beyond chickens, we'll need somewhere to keep livestock, maybe a couple of milk cows to start, then some horses." Willow looked at him, her heart swelling at his use of "we" and the future he was imagining for them. "That sounds wonderful," she said softly. "But Hank, I need to know, are you staying because you feel obligated, because you saved me from the fire and now feel responsible?" Hank crossed the small room to stand before her, taking her hands in his. "I'm staying because for the first time since I lost my home in Texas, I've found somewhere I want to put down roots." He lifted one hand to cup her cheek. "And someone I want to put them down with." The kiss that followed was deeper, more urgent than their first, filled with the promise of all that was to come. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Willow rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I should go," Hank said reluctantly, his arms still around her. "It's getting late, and Mrs. Benton will be wondering where I am." Willow nodded, understanding the propriety of the situation even as she wished he could stay. In a small town like Pioche, reputations were easily damaged and hard to repair. "Tomorrow," she said, walking him to the door, "we can start planning that barn." Hank grinned, tipping his hat as he stepped outside. "Yes, madam, bright and early." Throughout the summer and into the fall, Willow and Hank worked side by side, transforming her property from a charred ruin into a thriving homestead. The barn was built, sturdy and spacious, with room for the 2 milk cows Hank purchased at auction in Carson City. They added a small vegetable garden, repaired the well, and constructed a fence around the perimeter of the property, not just for practical purposes, but as a statement. This land was claimed, cared for, protected. As they worked, they talked, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future. Hank told her about his childhood on a Texas cotton farm, about losing his parents to yellow fever when he was 16, about joining the Confederate Army in the final months of the war more out of desperation than conviction. Willow spoke of her mother's death on the journey west, of her father's struggle with his war injury, of the loneliness she'd felt since his passing. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of Willow's cabin, watching the sunset paint the Nevada desert in brilliant hues. Sometimes they were joined by Mrs. Benton or other neighbors, but often they were alone, content in each other's company as they planned their next projects. Victor Caldwell, true to the agreement Hank had forced from him, left them alone. Occasionally, they would see him in town, where he would offer a curt nod before continuing on his way. The rumors of silver beneath Willow's land persisted, but with the mining operation finding rich veins elsewhere, the pressure to sell subsided. As autumn progressed and the first chill crept into the air, Hank became uncharacteristically nervous. Willow noticed his distraction one evening as they sat by the fire, her mending in her lap, him whittling a piece of wood with less than his usual skill. "Is something wrong?" she asked finally, setting aside her sewing. "You've been quiet all day." Hank looked up, then back at the half-formed carving in his hands. "Been thinking," he said, his voice gruff, "about the future, about us." Willow's heart quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "What about us?" Hank set down his knife and the carving, wiping his palms on his trousers before reaching into his pocket. "I've been saving," he said, producing a small velvet pouch. "From odd jobs in town, from selling that extra lumber." He opened the pouch and tipped a simple gold band into his palm. "It's not fancy, but it's perfect," Willow whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she realized what was happening. Hank moved from his chair to kneel before her, the firelight casting his features in warm shadow. "Willow Ashford, that night I rode past your burning house, I wasn't looking for anything except a few hours' sleep before continuing south. Instead, I found a woman willing to risk her life for her chickens." He smiled at the memory. "A woman with more courage and determination than anyone I've ever met." He held up the ring. "I love you, Willow. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, tears spilling onto her cheeks as she extended her hand. "Yes, I will marry you, Hank Navarro." The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. As Hank rose to take her in his arms, Willow felt a sense of completion she had never known before. The fire that had seemed like the end of everything had, in fact, been just the beginning. News of their engagement spread quickly through Pioche, and preparations for the wedding began in earnest. Mrs. Benton insisted on hosting the ceremony at her farm, where there was more room for guests. The date was set for the first week of December, before the worst of the winter weather set in. Willow, who had thought herself alone in the world after her father's death, was overwhelmed by the community's response. Women from town brought fabric for a wedding dress, men offered to build extra seating for the ceremony, and even the local saloon owner promised a barrel of his finest whiskey for the celebration. "I had no idea so many people cared," she told Hank one evening as they sorted through the gifts that had begun to arrive: handmade quilts, preserves, a fine set of china that had traveled all the way from San Francisco. "You underestimate yourself," Hank replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "People respect what you've done here, standing up to Caldwell, rebuilding after the fire. You've shown a lot of courage." Willow leaned against him, savoring the solid warmth of his presence. "We've shown a lot of courage," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." "That's not true," Hank said firmly. "You were fighting for this place before I came along. I just provided an extra pair of hands." "And a heart," Willow added softly, placing a hand on his chest. "You gave me back hope when I thought I'd lost everything." Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the desert landscape frosted with a rare dusting of snow that glittered in the winter sunlight. In Mrs. Benton's parlor, transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and ribbon, Willow stood before a mirror in the wedding dress the town's women had helped her create, a simple gown of ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, her mother's cameo pinned at her throat. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Benton said, adjusting the small wreath of dried flowers that crowned Willow's golden hair. "Like an angel," Willow smiled, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I never thought I'd be a bride," she admitted. "After Father died, I was so focused on survival, on keeping the farm." "Life has a way of surprising us," the older woman said, patting her hand. Now, are you ready? Your groom is waiting, and if his pacing wears any more of a path in my yard, I'll have to replant come spring." Hank, standing nervously by the makeshift altar, a simple arch decorated with pine branches, felt his breath catch as Willow appeared in the doorway. In that moment, all his years of wandering, of never belonging anywhere, seemed to fall away. Here in this place, with this woman, he had finally found home. As Willow walked toward him on the arm of old Pete, who had agreed to give her away in her father's absence, Hank felt a certainty settle over him. Whatever challenges they might face, they would face them together. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with the local justice of the peace officiating. When Hank and Willow exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice declared, beaming at the couple. "Mr. Navarro, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed was sweet and tender, a promise sealed before witnesses. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Willow felt a happiness so complete it almost overwhelmed her. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing, feasting and toasting. Even Victor Caldwell made an appearance, offering a grudging congratulations and a silver serving platter as a wedding gift. "Seems I misjudged you both," he told Hank as they shared a civil drink. "That land of yours is yielding quite well now. Those chickens of your wife's are providing eggs for half the town, I hear." "We're expanding into dairy too," Hank replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice. "Thinking of trying some crops come spring," Caldwell nodded appreciatively. "Good land for it, maybe not as valuable as I thought, but valuable in a different way." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." Hank clinked his glass against the mining magnates, a truce of sorts established. "To new beginnings." Later, as the party wound down and the last guests departed, Hank and Willow stood on Mrs. Benton's porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow they would return to their own home as husband and wife, to the life they had built together from the ashes of disaster. "Are you happy?" Hank asked, his arm around his new wife's waist. Willow looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she said softly. "And you?" Hank pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I rode into Pioche with nothing but the clothes on my back and no destination in mind. Now I have a home, a purpose." He tilted her chin up to meet his gaze. "And the most remarkable wife a man could ask for. Yes, Willow Navarro, I am very happy indeed." Their new life together began the next morning, as they walked hand in hand from Mrs. Benton's farm to their own property. The cabin looked different, somehow no longer just a shelter, but a home waiting to be filled with memories. "Welcome home, Mrs. Navarro," Hank said, sweeping Willow into his arms and carrying her across the threshold as tradition demanded. She laughed, her arms around his neck as he set her down in the main room, now furnished with the wedding gifts they had received. "It's perfect," she said, looking around at their modest but comfortable home. "Everything is perfect." Their first months of marriage passed in a contented rhythm of work and togetherness. Winter in Nevada was harsh, with bitter cold and occasional blizzards that kept them housebound for days. But inside their snug cabin, with the fire crackling in the hearth and their bodies entwined beneath warm quilts, Hank and Willow found a paradise of their own making. When spring arrived, bringing new life to the desert landscape, they expanded their operation as planned. Hank plowed fields for wheat and vegetables, while Willow added more chickens to their flock and began selling butter and cheese made from their cow's milk. Their reputation for quality goods spread, bringing customers from as far away as Carson City. It was on a warm evening in late April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset after a long day of work, that Willow shared the news that would change their lives once again. "I went to see Dr. Miller in town today," she said, her voice casual though her heart raced. "While you were fixing the Hendersons' roof." Hank looked at her with immediate concern. "Are you ill?" Willow smiled, reaching for his hand. "Not ill, just expecting." She placed his palm against her still flat stomach. "By Christmas, there will be 3 of us." The look of wonder that spread across Hank's face was something Willow knew she would remember until her dying day. For a moment, he seemed unable to speak, his eyes wide with surprise and joy. "A baby," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. "We're having a baby." Willow nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. "A baby, our baby." Hank gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Both of you." As Willow's pregnancy progressed, Hank became even more protective, taking on the heaviest work around the farm and insisting she rest whenever possible. Willow humored him to a point, but remained active in managing their growing business, now expanded to include a small orchard of apple and peach trees. By late summer, when her condition was obvious to all, they began preparing the second room of their cabin as a nursery. Hank crafted a beautiful cradle from pine, while Mrs. Benton and the other women of Pioche stitched tiny garments and soft blankets for the coming child. "Have you thought of names?" Mrs. Benton asked one afternoon as she and Willow sorted through the baby clothes. "Thomas for a boy after my father," Willow replied, running her hand over her swollen belly. "And for a girl, Eleanor after Hank's mother." The older woman nodded approvingly. "Fine names, both of them." As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, and the first anniversary of the fire that had brought them together approached, Hank and Willow took stock of how far they had come. Their property now boasted not just the cabin and chicken coop, but a sturdy barn, fenced pastures, productive fields, and the beginnings of an orchard. They had 3 milk cows, 2 workhorses, and nearly 30 chickens. More importantly, they had created a home filled with love and the promise of new life. "Hard to believe it's been almost a year," Willow said as they walked arm in arm through their land one October evening. "So much has changed." "All for the better," Hank replied, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. "Though I wouldn't mind if this year had fewer dramatic events than the last," Willow laughed, leaning into his solid presence. "I was just thinking we should invite the whole town for a harvest celebration. To thank everyone for their help this past year." Hank looked down at her with a smile. "Always thinking of others. That's one of the reasons I love you." The harvest celebration was held on a crisp November afternoon, with tables set up in the yard and food contributed by neighbors and friends. Lanterns were strung between trees, ready to light as evening fell, and someone brought a fiddle for dancing. As Hank watched his very pregnant wife moving among their guests, laughing and talking, pride swelled in his chest. Just over a year ago, he had been a drifter with no ties, no purpose beyond the next job, the next town. Now he was a husband, soon to be a father with a thriving farm and a place in the community. Victor Caldwell arrived late, bringing a bottle of fine brandy as his contribution. As he and Hank shared a civil drink, the mining magnate looked around at the transformed property. "I have to admit, Navarro, you've done well here," he said grudgingly. "Turned this place into something worth having." "It was always worth having," Hank replied, watching as Willow accepted a plate of food from Mrs. Benton. "I just helped uncover its value." As if sensing his gaze, Willow looked up and smiled at him across the gathering, a smile of such love and contentment that Hank felt his heart might burst with happiness. He excused himself from Caldwell and made his way to her side. "You should be sitting down," he admonished gently, guiding her to a chair beneath an apple tree. "I'm fine," Willow assured him, but she took the seat gratefully. "Just a little tired." Hank knelt beside her, one hand on her rounded belly where their child grew. "You've done enough. Let others take care of things for a while." Willow covered his hand with her own, a familiar gesture that never failed to touch him. "We've built something wonderful here, haven't we?" she said softly. "Yes," Hank agreed, looking around at their home, their land, their friends gathered in celebration. "Yes, we have." As the day faded into evening and lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over the festivities, Hank held his wife close as they swayed to a slow melody. Around them, other couples danced, children played, and the community they had become part of celebrated the season's bounty. "Thank you," Willow murmured against his chest. "For what?" for stopping that night, for saving my chickens, for staying." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shining in the lantern light. "For everything." Hank smiled, thinking of how far they had come from that desperate night when a fire had threatened to destroy everything. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You gave me a reason to stop running, to build something that matters." He placed a gentle hand on her belly, feeling the strong kick of their child. "You gave me a future." As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart with warm wishes and leftovers carefully wrapped, Hank and Willow stood arm in arm on their porch, watching as the last wagon disappeared down the road. "A good day," Hank said, pressing a kiss to Willow's temple. "A perfect day," she agreed, then suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. Hank looked at her in alarm. "What is it, the baby?" Willow nodded, her eyes wide. "I think, yes, it's time." Despite having prepared for this moment for months, Hank felt a surge of panic. "I'll get Mrs. Benton," he said, already moving toward the barn where his horse was stabled. "And the doctor." Willow caught his arm, a small smile playing on her lips despite the pain. "There's time," she assured him. "First babies don't usually rush." Another contraction hit, making her wince. But yes, perhaps Mrs. Benton would be good. The next 12 hours were the longest of Hank's life. Banished from the bedroom by Mrs. Benton and Dr. Miller, he paced the small cabin, flinching at every cry from his wife. Old Pete arrived to keep him company, offering sips from a flask of whiskey and stories of his own children's births to distract him. "Women are stronger than us in this way," the old farmer said sagely. "Built for it, they are." Hank wanted to believe him, but as Willow's labor progressed and her cries grew more frequent, his fear mounted. He had faced cattle rustlers, survived the war, and confronted men like Caldwell without flinching, but the thought of losing Willow terrified him in a way nothing else ever had. Finally, as dawn broke over the eastern mountains, a new sound filled the cabin, the lusty cry of a newborn. Hank froze mid-pace, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. A moment later, it opened to reveal Mrs. Benton, her face tired but radiant. "Congratulations, Mr. Navarro," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You have a son." Hank felt his knees weaken with relief and joy. "Willow," he managed to ask. "Is she tired but well?" Mrs. Benton assured him. "Go on in, they're waiting for you." On unsteady legs, Hank entered the bedroom where Dr. Miller was packing his bag and Willow lay propped against pillows, a small bundle in her arms. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her hair damp with sweat, but to Hank she had never looked more beautiful. "Come meet your son," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the exertion of labor. Hank approached the bed with reverence, sitting carefully beside his wife as she turned back the blanket to reveal a tiny, red face with a shock of dark hair. "Thomas Hank Navarro," Willow said, looking up at her husband with love. "After both the good men in my life." Tentatively, Hank reached out to touch his son's cheek, marveling at the softness of his skin. "He's perfect," he whispered, overcome with emotion. "You're both perfect, as Dr. Miller and Mrs. Benton discreetly left the new family alone. Hank carefully gathered his wife and son in his arms, mindful of their fragility. In that moment, surrounded by the morning light streaming through the cabin windows, he felt a completeness he had never thought possible. "I love you," he told Willow, his voice rough with feeling. "Both of you more than I can say." Willow leaned against him, their son sleeping peacefully between them. "And we love you," she replied, "our protector, our builder, our heart." In the years that followed, the Navarro family flourished along with their farm. Thomas grew into a strong boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes, followed 2 years later by a sister, Eleanor, whose arrival was considerably less dramatic than her brother's. The fire that had once seemed like the end of everything had, in fact, been just the beginning, the spark that had brought Hank and Willow together, forging a love strong enough to withstand any challenge and a home built on the foundation of that love. And though Willow's chickens had been the initial reason for their meeting the humble creatures, she had risked her life to save both. She and Hank knew the truth that had been spoken that fateful night, that she was worth more than any coop, any house, any possession. That the real treasure had been not in what was saved from the flames, but in what was found because of them. As they sat on their porch many years later, watching their children play in the yard of the thriving ranch their small farm had become, Willow leaned against her husband's shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever think about how different things might have been?" she asked. "If you hadn't been riding by that night, if the fire hadn't happened," Hank considered this, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes on their children. "I think we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "Some things are just meant to be." Willow smiled, thinking of all they had built together, a home, a family, a life filled with love. "I think you're right," she agreed, turning her face up for his kiss. "Some things are just meant to be." And as the sun set over their land, painting the Nevada sky in shades of gold and crimson, they knew they had found in each other the most precious treasure of all. A love that, like the phoenix of legend, had risen from the ashes to soar.